Great. So we're going to talk about what's going on with tech enablement. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of stories, what I'm sharing today, come from Technocon. Technocon is a community for tech enablement that we started a few years back. It was started by me, Rajan from LinkedIn at the time, and Jenny Blackburn, who worked at Salesforce at the time. So the three of us saw a need that people like us, I was at Twitter at the time, needed a way, a community to get together and share stories and learn from one another and get inspired and educated and informed. So that's kind of how all that started. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what is tech enablement, and then we're going to give real case studies from what companies are doing in the space. So stay tuned for that. So what do we mean by tech enablement? Well, as we studied this community, it changed the name a couple of times. It used to be called Tech Learn and then Technocon. And we were basically looking for a time and place where we can compare notes on things that are related to helping technical folks get better at what they do, right? So if you kind of unpack that, well, we needed onboarding, we needed to share knowledge. There was different ways of learning, formal and informal, such as peer learning. Then there's one-on-one type of learning, mentorship, coaching, office hours. Documentation is always a thing. And then there's also like the feedback loop. How do we collect the data? How do we measure how well the programs are working, and how do we create insights that we can then use to sell up to the management why we even exist? So that's kind of how it all started. And we basically consider tech enablement as this collection of different concerns that companies do to enable their people to do their best work. So with that, one of the insights is that usually a smaller company doesn't have this problem, right? Everything is easier when we're small, because the combination of various communication networks between people is relatively small. If I need to find something out, I just know which person to tap on the shoulder and learn from them. So we're really talking about this at scale as the company starts growing. So we also see at small companies this issue of everything is fine on my team. So in other words, a team almost acts as a small company. And again, teams are usually 10 or so people, and on a team, it's easy to know who knows what, and it's easy to connect those dots. It's the team-to-team communication and knowledge sharing that starts to suffer as the company starts to grow. And that ultimately what it causes is it causes a company not to be nimble, right? So suddenly you have teams that are very tight together, but they cannot be juggled and reconnected in a different way as the universe changes and as the company wants to adapt to the ever-changing world. So what we're going to explore is we're going to explore this concept of staying high performing, yet doing that as the organization scales. And what we're trying to basically address is the concept that one of our investors calls the organizational drag. So it's this issue that as the company scales, just like if you don't take care of your technology stack, you accumulate technical debt. We're also observing that if you don't take care of your people, you start accumulating organizational drag. So I'm going to start talking about some case studies. So the first one is from Twitter, more specifically Twitter engineering. And this is where I cut my teeth and learned the ropes. So back in 2013, Twitter was much smaller. It was a pre-IPO company. It was about 1,000 engineers, and it was starting to double in size. And up until that point, Twitter barely invested in anything remotely related to onboarding, for example, or educating people or getting people on the same page. So the result of that is that we had a lot of teams. Again, teams were great, but teams weren't within a team, they were great, but teams weren't talking to one another. And so Dick Costolo, the CEO at the time, he approached us. We were another startup. He ultimately acquired us. And when I was asking him, hey, what do you see in all this? his answer was he wanted to create a nimble organization. So he wanted an organization that's going to be adaptable regardless of what the next technological trend is, right? So at the time, it was the shift to mobile computing. But following all that was the shift to big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, etc. So all these shifts require organization that is nimble and that can adjust. The person that ran engineering at the time, Alex Rudder, we did this interview, and by the way, you'll see with all these case studies, there's basically a link to a story. So if you click on that, you can get the full interview transcription and the story. So and this one is actually about LinkedIn, so it's a wrong link. In this case, I'll fix it. But it's basically there's a story with Alex on how he scaled Twitter engineering, and one of the things that he observed is he had a choice. Should he hire another 100 engineers, which is the size of a small company, or should he make existing 1,000 engineers 10% more productive? Okay, so he chose to make the existing engineers 10% more productive, ultimately started a team called Engineering Effectiveness, and that was basically where we bottled up the Twitter engineering story. So that's the story of Twitter. Facebook had a similar experience earlier in its lifespan. So on the picture here, that's Wayne Chen. He's also one of our investors. Wayne is one of the early Facebook engineering managers. He joined the company when it was a dozen plus engineers. And when they were at 300 count, they noticed they started experiencing organizational drag. So basically, if you know the Facebook mantra of run fast and break things, he basically wanted to enable people to run fast and don't break things, right? So basically provide some kind of guardrails at that scale so that the engineers can still be very productive, but at the same time, they're not making 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So what Wayne did is he funded their engineering bootcamp. Arguably today, Facebook's engineering bootcamp is still one of the best in the world, and they're quite proud of that. They went even further. They even changed how they do recruiting. So if you kind of think about a typical company, like I can speak for Twitter because that's what I know. If I was an engineering manager, I would go hire somebody and I would get that person into my team and maybe allow HR for 1 day of onboarding and maybe allow somebody, the engineering organization some onboarding. But it was really up to me as a line hiring manager, right? Well, Facebook changed that. And so the way they do it is they bring people in and they keep them at the organizational level, at the engineering level. For up to 6 weeks before they actually hand them over to a hiring manager. And so what that does is it allows Facebook engineering to indoctrinate engineers into an organizational culture, give them an overview of entire Facebook stack, not just a specific team. So as opposed to being myopically onboarded by a line manager into a specific team, you get to see a bigger picture and kind of understand the entire Facebook. And that also allows new hires to choose which team they want to work on sometimes, to a certain extent. The devil is obviously in the details, but this is quite a departure from how the rest of Silicon Valley thinks about onboarding and kind of bringing people in. So that's the story of Facebook when they were much, much smaller. So I give you 2 quick stories from 2 companies you would know. So let's talk briefly about this concept of maturity, right? So one of the things we observed is that tech enablement is not yes or no. We all have it. We just have it at the different levels of maturity. So we put together this kind of index, and at the lowest level, it's sink or swim, right? And then it goes through these various stages of there's a hero volunteer, somebody raises a hand, there's a partial ownership, complete ownership, and ultimately it's a well-funded team. Don't worry about reading the text. We'll dive into each one of these separately, and I'll tell you a little story about each one. So sink or swim. So sink or swim is basically you do nothing, right? Or you do close to nothing. So we worked with WeWork when they were 800 engineers. So not a small organization. So engineering was 800, they were doubling. And at that point, their onboarding was still, here's the laptop, that's where the bathrooms are, and just go figure out how to check out code and get it running. All right, so that was the level of sort of sophistication they had, not much, in other words. And so we came in and said to fix that before they kind of went to the whole downsizing issue. GitHub was another example. GitHub does not do a lot of engineering organizational level onboarding. It's mostly based on individual managers, individual teams. So back to that siloed organization. And they recognize that it's a problem, but it's something that's cultural and not straightforward to fix for them, at least. Sometimes HR owns it. So engineering manager or the lead engineering leader says, this is not my concern. I'm just going to have HR deal with that. And then usually not much happens there. So this is the level 1 sink or swim. I used 2 examples here from big companies you would know, just to illustrate that this is not necessarily related to size. Right, so you could have a very large company that just kind of neglected to pay down the organizational drag debt, if you will, right? And so it accumulates. And by the way, Tomomi posted the link to the Twitter story in the chat. So thank you, Tomomi, for that. So hero volunteer. So at some point, as the company struggles, or engineering usually struggles with this, usually somebody raises a hand and says, I'm going to do something about that. So at Twitter, there was a gentleman by name Ryan King. He had enough of this inefficiencies, and he basically said, look, I'm going to start flight school and get the best people in the house to volunteer and tell their stories and share their insights and best practices. And so he ran that. He just used spreadsheets and duct tape to kind of organize it, and a bunch of volunteers to help him out. And so that was the stopgap for the bleeding that we had at the beginning. Carbon Health experienced a similar thing. They got to a point where they had hyper growth, right? So they were going from 5 to 90 engineers in something like 6-7 months, and very little to no formal onboarding and even giving thought to this. So a certain engineer, she raised her hand, got the program started, and at some point she said, hey, somebody else needs to own this and run it instead, because I got to do different things. So partial ownership. We see this when leadership at some point acknowledges, yep, this is an issue and somebody needs to own it, but it's usually somebody's other job, right? And it's usually a program manager or technical program manager, somebody of that nature that gets to own this, and they just do it on the side until this is solved for or another team is hired. So we've seen that at Carbon Health I mentioned. I've also seen this at Carta, where they're experiencing rapid growth, and then they nominated the TPM. Usually that's the kind of person that initially owns this concern to solve it. Full ownership is usually when there's a person that's dedicated to this. So it typically comes with size. Although we see smaller companies like Credit Karma and Cruise got full ownership of their technical universities very early on, so did not have to wait until the pain was real to address it, and that did wonders for them. Credit Karma, we did an interview with them, and they're quite proud of their CKU, Credit Karma University, and so is Cruise. So those are the programs that work very well. Kia also nominated somebody, so an example of a non-Silicon Valley company. And Spotify, we love Spotify for their collaborative learning, so their twist to peer learning and how they democratized it. And the final level of sort of ownership is when you have a fully funded team. So I mentioned Twitter earlier. Twitter leapfrogged a bunch of these levels of tech enablement maturity by investing into their university. It was a pricey way for them to do that, but it was something that they found very important. Then on the other side of extreme, we'll talk about Microsoft and Salesforce later on. And obviously, those are giants. Microsoft onboards 1,200 people per month, and he has over 100,000 engineers plus today. So very, very large organization. But there's some things we can learn from looking at them and how they approach it. All right, so with that, we're going to jump into talking about the building blocks, and we're going to actually look at, so if you're to implement tech enablement, what are the things to consider, and then how have your peers gone around doing that? So that's going to be our next section. And again, if you have any questions as we keep going along, feel free to raise your hand or feel free to just type it in the chat. I'm happy to pick it up at any point. So just heads up. But let's take a look at the building blocks. So if you think about taking a person, specifically a technical person, from knowing something to being fully proficient at something, there are a number of things that need to happen. And we're using onboarding here as an example, but onboarding doesn't just mean new hire. Onboarding could be, I'm a senior engineer, I want to become a staff engineer. It could be, I'm a team lead and I want to become a engineering manager. So there's a lot of these deltas internally where a person goes from point A to point B, right? Point A being here and point B being there. So en route to point B, usually there's some kind of codified knowledge, right? Some kind of way to define how you do things at your organization. And sometimes that's self-paced. It could be videos, articles, wikis. Sometimes it's instructor-led, so internal workshops and classes. And this really depends on, is this something that doesn't change, so it's stable and micro in nature? Like, how do I check out source code? That could be an article. Or is it more complex? You know, what does our stack look like, and why is it that way? So there's a lot of context needed, and so that's where live learning tends to prevail. Then just learning it doesn't mean that you internalized it yet, right? So there's also a need often for an opportunity to practice, to get your hands dirty, to actually do something. And that could mean workshops, again, live with the community, right? With the cohort, or it could also mean quizzes or sometimes labs, right? Ultimately, as people go down this path, even though they practice and learned, they can get stuck because things drift. The documentation or the content might not match the reality anymore. So how do you go from just dropping knowledge on people to actually having them be able to use it in the flow of work? And this is where support comes in, usually in the form of office hours, mentorship, coaching, one-on-ones, sometimes Slack, dedicated Slack channels, but basically a way to unblock people who are blocked. And then you usually want to close the loop by getting the data, so getting some kind of a feedback, like how is this working? Are people getting it? Are they coding in this? Are they happy? We'll talk about metrics and different ways to do that, and ultimately providing some kind of insights based on the data so that you can also justify your own existence. I had to do this at Twitter all the time, where leadership was, sometimes questioning, like, do we really need to be a team the size that we are? And what's really our impact to engineering, given that we're not writing code necessarily, but enabling others to write great code. So this is also a real thing, justifying existence and selling up. So with that, we're going to start talking about these building blocks. So again, the building blocks are things like onboarding, tech docs, mentorship, coaching, office hours, peer learning, and so on. And I'll tell you a little bit about each, and then I'll tell you stories, how your peers are doing it. So one of the things onboarding is usually the lowest hanging fruit. It's very important. People always need to do it. It's pretty much every company does it. And they do it at various levels of sophistication. Sometimes it's just, here's a Google Doc with a bunch of stuff or links to a bunch of stuff. And sometimes is much more thought through, like I mentioned in Facebook case, where they actually take you through a live boot camp with a cohort with which you practice and get experience of the entire Facebook and get oriented much better than at other companies. So I'll tell you a couple of stories and we'll see what you can pick up from that. So this is one of the more recent ones. It happened during COVID. So LinkedIn had their bootcamp, had it for a while, and COVID happened. And so basically within days, and we're talking about 3 days really here, they had to move from something that was fully immersive in-person experience in Sunnyvale office, right? Where they would fly people in to welcome them, to immerse them into the culture through their beautiful offices, etc., to now something that was fully online, right? And what they realized is that it wasn't just putting what was in person, putting that on Zoom. That did not communicate well, did not scale well. And they weren't even staffed to do that. They did not have instructors available for that and so on. So they had to re-engineer their entire approach, and they did that in 3 days. So from enabling it online, so having a way to manage now wait lists and signups and all that fully online, to figuring out how they're going to create their development environment that was not prior to that specifically for in-house experience, because they had this whole simulation of the stack in-house. So how to enable that? So there were some technical challenges, to communication, to involving managers, to creating work that feels like a bond of the community. In other words, it can feel extra lonely to just put people behind a Zoom session. They wanted to create a sense of community there, and still lean heavily on live, but also start augmenting it with some self-paced. So this is their story, and they were able to do that, and they tell a little bit more about how they went about that. Another one is Uber, and I think I saw Stephanie here earlier. This was a story from Uber also during the pandemic, and how Uber went around moving their engineering onboarding online. And in Uber's context, the difference was a nod to local experience. So there was this balance between wanting to onboard people onto Uber's engineering culture and stack and everything, but also giving some flexibility and ownership to the local teams. So Uber tends to empower their teams around the world to innovate locally and add to that. And so that was basically one of the differences. And I see Stephanie there. Anything that you wanted to add possibly and shine a light on how things are going there?
I think it's been going really well, and our satisfaction numbers have been higher now than they were even before the pandemic, which is kind of interesting. So would encourage everyone to kind of take that local nuance and really apply it, even as we go back to these more hybrid models of onboarding.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so Cameron was told a story, and so you can see all their insights. Again, it was one of those things that they had to do it on the dime, and they chose to think through that and also not to local differences and not just hold everything back in the mothership. So that's pretty cool. I love that you're measuring it and you know that it's going well. So that's the story of Uber. We already mentioned Carbon Health and how they wanted to do this. So again, they experienced a super rapid growth, and they did not have anybody hired to do this. So it was a senior engineer that stood up, and so she took on owning this for the time being. And then she made a case for getting a program manager to help her out and manage all this, because managing a program like this, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of logistics, and so she wanted to get somebody to help out. So that was their case study. And again, all of these are published, so you can also read about Carbon Health here and what Hannah did and how she got Bossmat to help her out as program manager. So that's Carbon Health and their explosive growth. All right, so that was a quick look at onboarding as the low-hanging fruit, and it's something that we see companies that are starting to invest in tech enablement. This is usually, like I said, onboarding is the lowest hanging fruit, and a lot of focus goes there initially. The next thing I wanted to mention is peer or collaborative learning, and it's basically this idea that the smartest people are right in the building, and how do you enable them to stand up and share themselves and make everyone better through doing that, right? So this is something that when I was creating Twitter University, with the team, this was something that we leaned on heavily. So basically, Twitter acquired us to come in and help them with Android and iOS and mobile, going mobile, right? And we thought, great, I wrote a book on Android, like should be walk in the park. I can teach people how to do Android. And once we got into Twitter, we realized that the problem wasn't Android. The problem was how Twitter uses Android. So there was a nuance of how Twitter uses Android. Engineers were smart enough to figure out Android itself, right? And then there was like, oh, whoops, like how am I going to explain how Twitter uses Android when I just got into the building? Like I'm new here. And so that's where we came up with this concept of let's enable others internally to just stand up and teach. And that was our promise. You as an expert, just stand up and teach. We're going to remove all the logistics, all the time wasting efforts of, getting people to sign up and nudging them to show up and checking them in and, all that logistics of running workshops and classes, we took over and automated, and people just show up, share themselves, and they loved it. And so that was a surprise. Engineers or technical folks love sharing their insights. They just don't want to deal with manual, boring, paper pushing tasks. So that worked really well over there, and it's still one of the highest rated programs in engineering. Spotify does something very similar. So they just call it collaborative learning. But the idea was also, the insight that they had was about knowledge networks. So if you think about like, why is everything great when we're small? Because the number of human connections internally is quadratic. So excuse me, if you have a small number of employees, it's easy to figure out who knows what, right? And usually that number is, the Dunbar number of like 100-ish. As the organization scales, especially if it scales rapidly, and especially if the internal tooling and internal know-how is complex, then you have this challenge of how do I connect to the right humans, right experts internally, and like get the understanding of this complexity, right? And so Spotify leaned heavily on collaborative learning and enabling that. It started with Alex. She tells the story of building that program at Spotify, and it's still something that runs strong over there. So I encourage you to check out that story. It's pretty inspiring. Another thing that this is a slightly different variation on peer learning, and it came out of necessities. So this is specifically Netflix Studios. So Netflix Studios brings in internal and external producers, right? So they help people make miniseries and movies for Netflix, and they have like some tens of thousands of such producers externally, and they have this tool chain of dozen plus. In this talk, they actually show the entire tool chain that you need to create a miniseries, and this is all in-house built proprietary Netflix software. That if you want to make a miniseries, you need to start wrapping your head around that and understanding it. Right. So the team that owns onboarding and getting people up leveled in tooling during pandemic leaned heavily on self-paced. They basically said, hey, this is, people are now working from home. They're working from everywhere. Time zones don't matter. Nobody's coming to the office. Why don't we just put everything, as content, right? To record everything, and make it available there. And so they did. And then what they experienced is what they call a lack of human touch, right? So there was basically the connections between humans started to suffer, and through that culture started to suffer. And if you know anything about Netflix, is that their culture is very, very important to them. That's the source of, that's their secret weapon. That's why they're so innovative, because of that culture of trust with one another. So what they did is then started shifting the pendulum back from this strictly self-paced, asynchronous, single-player experience to more of that blended experience where people can discover one another, can connect with one another, through chasing their mastery, right? Through chasing learning, they would connect, and through that they would ultimately form bonds and connections. So they call it, it's basically the blended learning approach. And so that's what they did, and this is their story of how that worked out for them. So more on LinkedIn. So a while back, 4+ years ago, there was one of their very senior engineers, Ben Lee. He started an internal tech talk series. So he basically just said, hey, as a staff engineer, I think it's really good for us other engineers to kind of get together and share best practices. And it just became like a little mailing list that he would like ping people and say, hey, Thursday at noon in such and such, conference room, we'll talk about such and such technical topic. And this started to get very popular. Engineers would come out of woodworks and start signing up for his mailing list. And this exploded and went from one tech talk to many, many tech talks. And so basically it just kind of like spread like a wildfire. And Ben was like, whoops, I can't manage this anymore. So he basically passed it on to an entire team. So back to tech enablement maturity, they're very mature. They have a fully funded team that owns this concern. So they passed this concern to that team, and that team took it to yet another level. So the richness of tech talks at LinkedIn Engineering is just amazing. And there's just so much knowledge shared, and it's all from internal people to internal people on topics that they're just in the flow of their work. So it's very little prep. It's just an engineer discovers a better way to do something and says, raises his hand, says, I'll create a workshop. And it's relatively easy for them to do that and inexpensive, and they do it all the time and heavily in that. So that's kind of how they close the knowledge gap, by making it easy for people to seek knowledge and making it easy for people to stand up and share and create a culture of knowledge sharing. So that's LinkedIn. We wouldn't be complete around tech enablement if we didn't talk about technical documentation. So technical documentation is, to some people, this is a holy grail, right? I sometimes talk to tech leaders, VPs of engineering, etc. And they usually, sometimes they just say, hey, we foster a culture of documentation. We'll just ask people, our engineers, to document everything. And there's a very romantic promise in that. And so we, oops, I went the wrong way. Sorry, where's my tech docs? So technical documentation. So we put this panel, and we actually invited LinkedIn, Uber, Spotify, and Splunk to talk about the documentation, because they're known for good internal documentation. And we asked a lot of questions about like, what are the issues, what works, what are the classes of documentation, and so forth. And so this is the story around that. A couple of things that we discovered is that just having the culture of asking people to document is not enough. One of the challenges is discoverability, right? How do you find the right docs? So I'll give you an example. When I took over Tech Docs team at Twitter, the problem wasn't that we didn't have documentation. The problem was we had too much, right? We actually had the world's largest Confluence installation at the time. And the challenge was, if I search for an answer, I would get 10 different answers from 10 very credible internal experts on my question. And so I wouldn't know who to trust. right? So discoverability was an issue. We also had multiple platforms and so on. I'm seeing this not just at Twitter, I'm seeing this at Atlassian, who makes Confluence. So similar issue of being canonical and being authoritative for the docs. Another thing we're seeing is drift, right? So this is very common in a company that's growing and it's rapidly changing, which all tech companies are. So by the time we document something, it's already out of date. So that's a challenge as well. So how do you manage the drift? So the documentation is not lying, but it's in sync with what it's documenting, right? So ownership, who owns the documentation? Is it the team? Is it the central, like the team that owns the product? Is it the centralized tech docs team? How do you then manage such team and so on? And I already mentioned various types of docs from API docs to guides to how-tos to run books to, playbooks, etc. So there's different classes of documentation, each with its own intricacies, and so that's something to think about. And we hosted a panel where your peers shared how they reason about it. I'm going to skip to mentorship, coaching, and office hours. So one of the things that we also observe is that sometimes the simplest, easiest way to enable technical folks is just to pair them up, right? So we've been doing this from the days of pair programming, and more recently, what we see a lot of is so-called buddy system, right? So you join a company and they just assign you a buddy, and that person is now responsible to shadowing you. It's usually very ad hoc beyond just being assigned. So what happens with the buddy is usually ad hoc, but we're also seeing that there are different types of this one-on-one office hours mentorship and coaching programs. So I'm going to walk through a couple of stories from companies that we had hosted at Technocon. So one of my early experiences was with Airbnb. So Airbnb already had peer learning program. They were super proud of that and worked really well. And they came along and said, hey, we're thinking of launching a peer mentorship program. Essentially, the idea was that anyone can mentor anyone at Airbnb. So at the time they had 5,000 employees just about, and they wanted to kind of enable that. It came down from Brian Chesky. It came out from the leadership. So they went on stage and said, we believe in this, and we're gonna walk our talk, and we're gonna basically have executives mentor people underneath them, and so forth and so forth. The way they operationalized this was that for somebody to become a mentor, they actually had to take a workshop. So it was a 4-hour workshop where you learn how to become a mentor. And they gave you a simple framework. It was something around something called GROW, goals, realities, or opportunity, options, and way forward. So they use that as a framework to get people to know how to mentor one another. And then they started launching a number of sessions. A year into this, Anna, who managed this program, she did a talk at Technocon. So this is the transcript of the talk. And she basically said about 10% of the employees were mentors at Airbnb. So if you think about it, they went in 1 year from no mentors to 500 plus mentors for everyone internally. And they had amazing ratings, and were able to track everything, and they were super proud and happy how the program went. Shopify did something different. The story again started with Toby, their founder, and Toby had a personal executive coach. And so this coach did wonders for him as a CEO. And then he said, well, if it works for me, why don't I bring this coach to coach my entire C-suite, all the executives? And so that worked really well. And then he started thinking, well, how do we scale this? And so what they did, as opposed to doing it internally with their own people, they actually went externally and recruited a dozen professional coaches. So they basically built this mini team of professional coaches across the country, across the world, actually. And they started offering coaching as a service for everyone at the company. There were about 4,000+ people at the time, and any employee could go on an internal website and say, I am looking for a coach in this location at this day that speaks this language, because they're French Canadian, so it's French and English, and they could basically pick up who they want. And so this is the story of how they operationalize that, and it's the coaching corner is still working pretty well over there. Dropbox recently did a talk about their vision. So they also started with a C-suite, and they looked at making it available to everyone. They just took a little bit of a more methodological approach, and which also means a little slower and more conservative. And you can sort of see that graph of building the team and then piloting Coach's Corner. Again, they were inspired by Shopify. So they were basically starting where traditional companies go in the Shopify model, with eventual vision to go to where Airbnb model is. So this is a story of Dropbox and how they are still executing on that on this roadmap. Autodesk did something different. They just like most tech companies, they needed to get engineering managers up to speed. And as we know, usually engineering managers are people who are engineers and then are tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, become manager, which means you have a totally new job. Right, and usually you as a new manager are not very well equipped to do this job. So they created this so-called group coaching. I also know it as forum, but it's basically a small intimate group where you have a high level of psychological safety, and they were able to create those groups for new engineering managers to come together. They would, first of all, it was one of those, what goes in the room stays in the room. So it was creating a safe place for them to discuss things. But they would also bring a more seasoned EMs or directors to serve as moderators and to answer any questions. So this was the model that they leaned on for group coaching. So it's a very interesting story of a slightly different twist to what we consider coaching. So that was about mentorship coaching office hours as a way to get people up to speed and on a career growth path. I'm gonna explore one more use case here, which is external expertise. So how certain companies also lean on knowledge from outside of the building. So far we've been mostly talking about various ways to use internal experts to get people up to speed. And while for the most tech companies, internal expertise is the key, right? Because that's where the magic is. Presumably we're already hiring smart people. These are a couple of stories of two companies, one very large, one very small, that leaned on external resources as well. So Salesforce, obviously huge. They 18,000 employees and counting. So they have external vendors. As a matter of fact, my previous company that got acquired by Twitter was at one time a Salesforce vendor, so we got to know them from that side of the table as well. And they use this to basically get people up to a certain level, right? Usually 80–90% of proficiency on what I call vanilla knowledge, right? So you want to learn Java, Scala, Hadoop, Android, whatever the cool new technology stuff is, you can do it through with knowledge from experts from outside of the building. And then you can just add that little extra that's special sauce to you later on. And this works for Salesforce very well because they're stable as an organization, right? Like they've been around for a while, their stack is known, few things are in flux. So it's easy for them to have a large part of that be outsourceable and then add the magic on top of it. So that's what they do. On the other side of the spectrum is a small company out of Montreal, Essence. They are an e-tailer that sells $800 t-shirts if you're in the market for that. And I worked with them when they were tiny, 50 engineers, 40, 50 engineers. And they wanted to build Essence University for a couple of reasons. First of all, they were changing stack internally, going from monolith to microservices. So they wanted to kind of retool everyone internally. Secondly, they wanted to build a brand from themselves in Montreal as a powerhouse, great place to work at. Right. So what they did is that they created the Stack University, but they also started sending, to bootstrap it, they started sending the engineers to coolest conferences. So this was a perk to engineers, but the kickback was an engineer has to then talk about that at the tech university. And so that's kind of how they bootstrapped it. Okay. So fast forward a couple of years, and they're now 250 engineers, and they went from an e-tailer to a tech powerhouse. And actually, we're going to have them at TechnoCon. So Fabienne, the VP of Engineering, is going to tell this story. So it's going to be super awesome. Yeah, the moment just posted. So it's April 6th. If you're interested, sign up on the TechnoCon website. I just love that story of not just tech enabling people, but tech enabling an entire company and changing its trajectory altogether. So that's it's pretty cool. Oops. So to wrap things up, I just want to talk about metrics and how do we measure things, right? So this is often a question that always comes up because we need to often sell our own existence to the leadership, like why do we exist and how are we helping the company as a whole. And there are different things to kind of measure. There's the infamous Kirkpatrick, then there's time to productivity, culture to attrition, what's our recruiting brand, etc., etc. I'm just going to give you two stories. So one is from LinkedIn. So Rajan, who was I mentioned earlier, Rajan and I started TechnoCon together. So Rajan is very curious about metrics. He looked at their engineering bootcamp through the lens of Kirkpatrick model. So level 1 is easy, not easy. And that's usually your happy sad face, right? Rated on scale 0 to 10 or 5 stars or whatever. Level 2 is usually relies on did you get what you learned, right? And so as opposed to asking quiz questions like normal L&D people would, he relied on a demo day. So they have in days, which is their version of Hack Week. And so they basically have people demonstrate. So if you build something useful, demonstrate it. So Salesforce actually does something very similar. We had a talk from Paul recently on that. Like, here's a picture of a pirate ship, go build it. That sort of approach. So you ultimately demonstrate your knowledge by having done what you would normally do in the flow of work. Level 3 is, what's the impact on the behavior of the person that has gone through the experience? And so here they relied on feedback. So it was sort of like self-reporting. They would ping you 30, 60 days afterwards and say, hey, now that you've done Eng Bootcamp and got your hands dirty, what's the result of that? Have you been able to use that in the flow of work? And number 4 is the ultimate impact on business. So how well are we enabling our technical folks to actually make the business ship faster or innovate more and so on? And so that's usually challenging. We are leaning now on managers reporting that a little bit. So the tricky part is understanding the management structure and all that. But that's kind of the holy grail that LinkedIn, Rajan, and many other people are sort of chasing. So that's Kirkpatrick. I just love throwing Microsoft as a sort of the outlier here. Like I mentioned earlier, Microsoft onboards like 1,000 engineers per month, right? Which is larger than most of our organizations altogether. So, and they're just monthly. So they have a very sophisticated way of tracking a lot of metrics. They're just like highly data driven because there's so much data to be driven by. And so in this talk, Chris Schaefer talks about just 3 things: time, resources, and manager involvement, and how they reason about that, and various metrics that they'll look at that. So their model is much more sophisticated with much more data. But they're also a much bigger company, may not apply to all of us. It's just something that can be inspiring as a story. So that's that on metrics. Just wanted to kind of wrap up with some general trends that we're seeing in the industry. So remote first work is a thing. We're now seeing a lot more going back to office. So things that were sort of an issue at the beginning of the pandemic are becoming a different issue now, where some teams are going back to the office, and you have this hybrid, and the hybrid is weird. Sometimes it's, cohesive teams, sometimes it's organizationally hybrid. So like what those boundaries are is not super clear, and that impacts how we approach our work. Of course, in ideal world, everything would be just self-paced if culture did not matter, if human connection did not matter. But because it does, we're seeing a lot of companies lean on blended experiences. So some things you can do on your own, but some things it's better to do with a cohort, because that's how you get indoctrinated into the culture, meet your folks, just feel better about your work and so on. And another thing that we are seeing is tech enablement as a thing. If a year ago, it was not many people were talking about the term. And now on Technicon Slack channel, we're seeing a lot of job postings with this title. Most recently, Peloton we got the story from Peloton, how as they were slashing staff and downsizing, they pivoted their tech learning to become tech enablement, and as such became a strategic initiative. And as such, it was actually funded more, as opposed to being sacked, as learning usually does in a downturn. So it was just an inspiring story of how they repositioned what they do as something that's strategically very important to the business. And VP of engineering bought it and funded it and supported it. So that story is going to be published soon, so I don't have a link yet, but we're working on it. So that's that in a nutshell. Any quick questions? I know we kind of it was longer than I thought, but any questions, comments, concerns? Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Marko? Thank you.
Yeah.
That was a great presentation. We have an audience that is catering to the developmentally disabled. And what was kind of uncovered during COVID was there used to be this assumption that no one could go online to do their learning. And what kind of evolved was that, geez, a lot of people actually wanted to learn online. And so we're building a platform that's largely based in workforce development for training for people to go out and get jobs. And currently, most of the services that are provided for them are lacking. There's like 85% of the people that are developmentally disabled can't get a job because they don't have the education. So we're using the platform to provide that education. And one of the things that I'm curious about with the analytics and some of the reporting out is what we've kind of uncovered through this process of building the plane right now is that we can also identify gaps in learning, so that if we know that an individual was able to accomplish these 6 skills for workforce readiness, but fell down on skills 7 and 8, maybe there's another unit that needs to go in there to teach that individual how to stretch to 7 and 8, if that makes sense. So I'm just curious with some of the analytics on the backside, if you all kind of posited certain questions that you wanted to have answered, or how some of these larger companies use the backside to shape their next steps. It's kind of a big question.
Yeah, nothing comes to mind right now. We do have one of these panels that Tomom is working on putting together that's going to be specifically around metrics. So if that's okay with you, I suggest stay tuned, because it's coming up in the next month or so, and we'll have your peers on stage discussing that.
That sounds great.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, yeah, I don't have it, and nothing comes to mind. Even though we have 50 plus these stories, metrics is always a hard one. It's always like one of those tough questions. So. Any other questions, comments?
Hey, Marko, thank you for the presentation. And I'm glad to see there's looks like there's hours of videos and stories linked within to delve deeper into a lot of this. I'm kind of still feeling new to the community and really excited, because I feel like everything you're talking about is exactly the kind of problems that my team and I are working on. So it's great to finally have found the people. Did you mention that these came out of a conference? And if so, when is there a next one? How can I continue to be more involved?
Yep. So we are, so Technocon is a, hold on a second. And let me see why I can't share. So Technocon is a community, and so we run events every month. So sign up for the next one, and I'll put it here in chat, and we can follow up with you as well on that. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, Tomomi will make sure that you get all the comms. So, I'll be sending this deck to you, just so you know. So from that deck, you'll have links to all the stories. And yeah, I super appreciate you being here. Just yeah, it's great to see that people are doing cool stuff as well. So thank you very much.